Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm FFINLO COSTAIN, editor of 8.9.com. Biodiversity net gain is a world-leading, market-led policy designed to restore nature while unlocking sustainable development. But as the government considers the future of the policy, new research has identified opportunities to strengthen delivery, accelerate market growth, and achieve greater benefits for nature, developers, and communities. I'm joined by the report's lead author, David Hill, former Deputy Chair of Natural England and founder of the Environment Bank, and by contributor Rob HINDLE, the Executive Director of Rural Solutions. Welcome both. David, could you talk me through the key contention that your research was testing?
Yeah, sure, Finlo. Well, this goes back, if I may, sort of 2006, when I spent so many years working with developments to try and mitigate their impacts and realised that within the boundary of a development site, it just doesn't work. You cannot actually deliver biodiversity value and protect the biodiversity that's there on those sites by doing that. And so came up with the idea of biodiversity offsetting, which morphed into biodiversity net gain. And so really it was about trying to get development to properly account for its impacts on nature. And that's where it started. Having gone through the whole many years of trying to get this into law, finally we succeeded in 2021 and it was implemented in 2023, or actually early 2024. But unfortunately, there was this preference for on-site delivery, which effectively went right the way back to where we started from. Why, I set the Environment Bank up, which I'm not now engaged with, but we set that up to really challenge this whole idea that on-site dealing with biodiversity works, and it actually doesn't. Only in very few cases of large sites. So that's where it came from. So I sort of decided last year to assemble a team of people that span the whole sector that we work in. So Rob joined me from the planning sector. We had Nina Pindham, Cornerstone Barristers, Neil Beamsley from Bellway Homes Limited, and Jason Bedell, basically really good on cost viability analysis from Stratton Parker. The five of us got together and we worked through how could we actually demonstrate where the value for BNG came from, and that's why we focused very much on delivering off-site, and that's where it came from.
So we're going to be talking quite a lot about off-site, for the rest of the podcast, but let's just dwell for a moment on the on-site element, because it always seemed to me to be a bit of a stretch that you could deliver sort of enhanced biodiversity on a development site while that development was taking place, because of course it's a very interventionist thing to do, isn't it, to develop land? So just talk to me about why the on-site preference was there in the first place. Why did that happen, just from a policy perspective?
Well, really good point. In the first place, it wasn't there. It basically, I think, suffered a bit from policy creep and people thinking, policy folk within government thinking that people want nature immediately where they live. Well, they like it and want it pretty close, but actually also it's not necessarily everyone's cup of tea. So we found that the real value would be from creating bigger sites elsewhere, and it was policy creep effectively, and it's been quite difficult to challenge because there's this notion that people want nature in where they live. But if you've got a housing scheme, what actually ends up happening is that any small token of landscaping or planting that is made into biodiversity value is pretty untidy, and it also basically gets removed and trimmed away or it doesn't function effectively. So that's why you can do your landscaping and planting, brilliant, making great homes and houses. But of course, for commercial warehousing and development sites and even big infrastructure plant, there are a whole range of reasons why you can't do something within the boundary of the development site. Warehousing, commercial logistics, distribution centres and parks, for example, large slabs of concrete and tarmac and large sheds. And anyway, who's going to go and value any biodiversity uplift in those areas? I doubt anybody really would do.
I guess that comes back to Sorry, go on, Rob.
There was also a sort of a philosophical perspective from the previous government around communities should benefit from the delivery of nature as close as possible to where the development was taking place. So those people that were suffering the development should benefit from the nature, and that follows through to an extent. So that's where the sequential preference came for on-site delivery. And then it follows through into the spatial multiplier for the units, which actually incentivizes developers who are going off-site to go off-site within the local authority where they're developing, rather than going outside of the local authority. So that kind of thread runs through the way the regulations were put together, and has been a key element of driving sort of the on-site preference, particularly within the residential development sector.
Yeah, I'm interested as well, because where David was talking there was this sort of emphasis on nature being something that people should appreciate, that people should enjoy. And I just wonder, where that balance lies between nature being delivered for the sake of nature, and therefore, as a sort of site that an insect can get from one site to another, without it becoming an island, or whether it is there simply for the purpose of human beings to enjoy that nature. And I guess that was the contention that we were starting to get to with sort of warehousing and those sorts of sites, David.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that ultimately, of course, biodiversity loss is an existential threat equivalent to that of climate change. Climate change obviously gets, for a variety of great reasons, most of the publicity. But if we lose our biodiversity, which we are doing, 66% decline in biodiversity in the last 6 decades, it's extraordinary. Then there is only one direction that the human species will go, because we rely, 55% of global GDP relies on what nature provides, yet no one's really accounting for that. It's a major, major risk to corporates and to business generally. So actually, where do we start? We've got to start somewhere, and we're starting with the development sector that are being able to not only consume their own smoke, but actually create and put back more than is impacted, which is the whole philosophy around BNG and the at least a 10% uplift in biodiversity from coming out from the development site. So nature inherently has incredible value to us. It has economic value to us, and it also has health and well-being benefits to us. So most of us, I'm sure, when we go out for a walk in the countryside, we really enjoy, or should be enjoying it. Problem is that there isn't as much biodiversity now as there was by any stretch, and that's the issue we have to address at scale and quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that phrase, consume your own smoke, the idea of the development sector offsetting its own damage. I just wonder, before we sort of move on, about the attitudes of the development sector, because presumably government was having conversations with the development sector throughout the development of the BNG policy. Did you have a sense that the development sector was itself sort of pushing for more on-site delivery, or was their preference for off-site?
Interestingly, the preference actually was for offsite if it could actually be delivered by a third-party provider, because it strips away their 30-year liability. But that liability only sits with an on-site delivery, where the planning authorities have the enforcement powers to say, hang on a minute, you haven't delivered this, and we've given you a planning permission on the basis of it. So what are you going to do to restore it? And that doesn't happen. So at the moment, really, there is emphasis on-site, because first of all, the developer thinks maybe they can get away with doing that, and fair enough if that's what they want to do. And secondly, there hasn't until now been the opportunity to do lots of offsite very easily and frictionlessly, but now there is, with the creation of lots and lots of people are coming forward in a speculative way, but also in a strategic way, to provide offsite areas, habitat banks, for example, that can supply the demand from the developer. So actually, it's much easier now than it was 12 months ago to do something offsite and basically say, look, we don't want that 30-year liability, because we move on after 5 years from a development site, residential site, for example. We've moved on, and we haven't really got the capacity or the ability to continue with our engagement with that site for 30 years. So offsite makes a whole load of real value propositions to the development sector. And so I think they are valuing now offsite more, but it needs that extra push and policy switch in terms of preference to make it happen entirely, I think.
So, David, the report focuses, as we've sort of started to get into, on the comparative value of on-site or off-site biodiversity net gain delivery. Why now? Why have you published it now? Is there a particular policy sort of reason?
Well, I think two good reasons. One is that we realise that we've now got over 12 months of operation of BNG, so we can see what's happening, and we think the evidence is pointing to something like 80-90% of BNG being delivered on site in very, very small parcels with no longevity or likelihood of surviving for very long. And the government has published its consultation that closed last week on small scale and brownfield sites and how BNG should be treated, with the opportunity for an exemption. Well, we believe that you shouldn't have an exemption other than a very, very small site of, let's say, smaller than 0.1 hectare, but the rest can easily contribute and deliver their BNG requirement by buying offsite units from providers, of which there are many scaling. So really, we've got really good evidence as to what's happening, and we think that now is the time to just fix that preference, which really isn't generating any value, and it's not generating any value in fixing the nature finance gap either, which, as we know, sits at between 4.4 and 9.7 billion pounds a year, that we need to find out with the public sector to actually deal with this huge biodiversity crisis that we've got.
Rob, I wonder, just to sort of help us through the report now, whether you could take me through the key findings and why each of those is important.
Yes, certainly. So the key findings, there are 5 key findings, and they relate to the small areas of delivery of BNG predominantly through on-site delivery. The relative costs of delivering on-site and off-site, the impact on development viability and house prices and development outputs of delivering BNG on-site, issues associated with government and enforcement of BNG once it's been delivered on-site, and the contribution that the BNG market, BNG more widely can make to filling the nature funding gap through private sector intervention and investment. So taking those one at a time, small areas is really important in terms of benefits for nature that the BNG policy was fundamentally brought in to address. Not just mitigating the impact of development, but delivering a net gain for nature from development. Small areas on site are not doing that. In the main, they are contributing some sort of localized benefits around access to green space and sort of exposure to biome for the residents of these developments, but they're not capable of delivering any meaningful nature recovery, and so the effort is being, from a nature perspective, essentially wasted through pretty much through that area of delivery. It's expensive to do on site. It's expensive in terms of if you have to make a choice between using land to build a house on or using land to deliver BNG on your site, it's a very expensive choice, and it's taking significant value out of the development site, both for the landowner, the developer, and in many ways the house buyer, because the house buyer is funding the cost alongside the landowner and the developer.
What's the difference in those sort of costs, whether it's on-site or off-site, to the developer, Rob? And where does that financial burden ultimately lie?
Well, there's been some really interesting analysis brought forward in the report, which Jason and David did. So I'll let Jason come in on the numbers. The cost lies both often with the landowner, because development of house building essentially works on paying a price for land that is assessed after the costs of the development are taken into account. But the costs also lie with the house buyer, because the actual cost of delivery and then maintaining that biodiversity net gain will lie with the house owner and their neighbours. David, in terms of the specific differences, over to you.
Yeah, so we were fascinated by this. So Jason Biddell and myself built a model that we will make available to anybody who wants to look at it. But it basically took a whole range of parameters relating to an average residential development site, I have to add.
Yeah.
And there are two factors that mean that we don't believe that the true cost of understanding BNG within the development site are recognizing. One is as Rob said, when you develop land, so when you buy land, the development land price you pay is multiple times its agricultural value, multiple into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions per hectare. If you take that into account, as well as the fact that you're losing profit on those houses that you are not therefore building on that land, then one BNG unit costs around £896,000. Now, I'm sure many developers will just, sharp intake of breath on that one. But actually, we couldn't find a way to make that change. We think that is actually true as long as you factor in loss of profitability and loss of value of the land that you're paying for. And so that compares with one BNG unit that you could buy off-site for around £27,000 to £30,000. So it's if we are seeing on-site factored in, it's really because the true cost of the use of that land is not being applied within the BNG model. It's being, I'm not saying fudged, but I think there's some sort of interesting economic calculations not being done really to face up to that.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the developer impact element of your key findings here, and it talks about on-site cost adding between £12,000 and £15,000 per house to the house buyer, where if that BNG was delivered off-site, then it would be more like £3,000, which is much more reasonable.
And that's it, at face value. That sounds. It also sounds pretty awful, and but it's not actually. We don't believe that the house buyer is really necessarily going to be contributing or anything like that. To be honest, it's going to be the residual land value that gets the impact. So if I've got a chunk of agricultural land that I get allocated for development and I sell it to a developer, well, the options on that land will probably factor in the fact that we've got the BNG to pay for. So we'll take that off the value of the land. So ultimately, it will be the windfall uplift to the landowner of the land who sells his land to development that pays. But you couldn't translate that into, something like £400 to £500 for on-site per year for your 30-year period, or about £100. So it's a big difference. And I think that actually, what is going to be better? It's going to be £100 that is subsumed within the cost of the house, and do it off-site, and then your job is done and the liability goes away.
Thank you, Rob. I interrupted you in the middle of going.
No,
through
not
the
at
key
all.
findings.
And just to add to that sort of cost thread, it's not just a financial cost, it's also a cost in terms of land take and the ability to deliver the housing supply that we need as quickly as we need it. Because, if each housing site that's coming forward is only delivering, I don't know, let's not worry about the percentages, but, if it's delivering less than the total number of houses it could deliver, because it's being sort of in some ways forced to deliver BNG on site, then that is not very effective way of using land when there is a significant volume of land which is ready and willing to deliver those BNG units off site. So that cost finding goes beyond the financial cost of delivering individual housing units, which spills into the capacity and the density of the unit of the sites that you develop. And obviously, it goes to the relativity of cost between off-site delivery and on-site delivery, which is another part of the key findings. And then we move on to government and enforcement, and this really is about a pretty fundamental difference at the moment, about an unlevel playing field between the way that the BNG is delivery of BNG is monitored and enforced on-site versus off-site. So obviously one of the fundamental points of BNG is to create nature benefits for the long term. There's a 30-year minimum timeline on delivering biodiversity net gain within the law. House building is a task and finish process. You buy the land, you build the houses, you sell the houses, you move on to another site. And and very often, essentially, what you do is you leave the maintenance of the common areas behind to some form of management company, either one that you expect the residents themselves to look after, or that's a professional organisation that's a management company that charges a service charge to the residents. Those management companies are not equipped to look after biodiversity for 30 years. That's entirely not what they're there for. And so the management obligations of 30 years delivery is just not within the house building sector structure at all at the moment. Add on to that the fact that it's the planning authorities who are responsible for monitoring that delivery over 30 years and then enforcing against lack of delivery. Well, that's an enormously onerous thing to expect them to do across a series of residential sites of all different shapes and sizes. The alternate position on an off-site scenario is you're dealing with a professional organisation or individual that has set themselves up to deliver services that has to enter into legal agreements with the local authority in order to do so, has to enter into a legal agreement with the buyer of the offsetting unit to deliver that unit, and within those contracts, the 30-year delivery commitment and the monitoring and the enforcement and the paying for the monitoring and the enforcement are all addressed and enshrined within that commercial contract and within the contract with the local authority. So the situations are significantly different on-site, off-site in terms of governance and enforcement, and that's obviously.
It sounds like a fundamental structural problem with the legislation. Really, it's not just about nuance, is it? It's about there are structural reasons why it's really difficult to deliver on site in terms of ensuring that integrity.
Absolutely, this is not people trying to. It's not people trying to avoid their responsibilities. It's the fact that the structure within the industry is just not set up to deliver against those responsibilities, and it was never expected to do so, because if you go back to where David came in, the whole focus of this was to take the delivery of the mitigation and the additional nature recovery away from the developer and allow them to fund it being done properly somewhere else.
And so the last slide, just before you come in, David, I just wonder, just because I keep interrupting Rob, I'd like Rob to get to the end of the list of
okay.
Key
Well, then the last point is around the filling the funding gap, filling the nature fund recovery funding gap, and critically the contribution that the BNG market can and will, if it's enabled to, make towards the establishment and getting beyond that key sort of early years challenge for a private nature market in England. David will tell you with far more authority than I, but mandatory BNG is a world leading policy. And it's a world-leading policy both in terms of its intent around nature recovery, but critically, it's a world-leading policy in terms of the opportunity it presents to create a market for private finance and private funding, investing in and paying for nature-based solutions. And we're so close to that being incredibly exciting. But the holding on of the benefit on site is capturing far too much of that opportunity, and if you look at the biodiversity UK report, which was on your website the other day, in terms of how well established, how quickly an off-site supplier market has developed. They're all there waiting, and yet the demand that they were kind of promised, raised to expect, is being held on to by the preference for on-site delivery. So potentially that's a massive lost opportunity for nature, but also for many landowners and land managers and farmers who are looking very keenly towards this as an opportunity for improved farm resilience and diversification.
Yeah, I'm feeling the analogy of somebody that's sort of really excited about going on their sort of outdoor activities adventure, and they're at the top of the cliff waiting to do the abseiling, and the abseiling they know is going to be thrilling and that it's going to be a good ride, but they just can't quite sort of release the grip of their fingernails, and it is that it's releasing the market, it's getting the market to fully function, getting farmers to fully embrace and landowners to fully embrace the market, which is a real challenge. So David, yeah, let me come back to you.
Thanks, Finlo. I mean, the key point on cost is, and rather than getting carried away of that it's an expense, we found with a lot of evidence that the cost of delivering BNG off-site is around 0.6% of the gross development value. And I think one of the most amazing legacies of BNG will be to have shown how you create a compliance market that could be applied to the corporate sector down the line, hopefully very soon. So if you could imagine 0.6% of economic activity in the UK being available to create natural capital and restore this vital nature for us, that comes out at about 15 billion pounds a year available on a 0.6% cost. I mean, and that to actually enable us to deliver that 55% global GDP requirement or delivery is a very, very small cost indeed. And so that's the next thing that I'm looking at, or we're going to be looking at, is how does the corporate sector engage with this in the same way? Developers are showing how to do it, and if we can get this preference switched to offsite, we're off, and then it will really make a massive difference to how we do nature recovery in this country and elsewhere. As Rob said, globally a critical policy, I think, now.
And in relation to those findings, David, are there other sort of policy implications that you'd like to draw out?
It's a good challenge. I mean, I think the problem has been that there's been too much emphasis on an assumption of what people need or want immediately where they live. And so that in any future policy, I think we've really got to get evidence. There's no evidence that people just want this huge biodiversity impact immediately where they live, because of the whole range of issues to do, as we've explained. I also think that the policy move towards corporate entities being required to disclose their impacts on natural capital be incredibly valuable, because that's the way that once you've disclosed it and you can account for your impact as a business on natural capital, what risk am I as a business to that 55% global GDP figure not being seen in the future because it's going to collapse with biodiversity going down. I think policies now need to focus on that, and it will probably be through financial regulations rather than environmental regulations with the general corporate sector. And I'd probably leave it there for now. But there will be, all I'd say is make sure when the government sets policy, it really talks to people that understand how markets work. Critical.
I guess sort of where I'm kind of heading to and what I'm asking is, I hear quite often from farmers that they're sort of looking at BNG, that they see it as being an opportunity, but currently it's very much an opportunity for the few rather than the many, that it's being talked up, but there isn't really any great volume to this. And so I guess the question is about scaling and whether you think that this shift from on-site to off-site really would sort of stick a motor under that sort of scaling potential, and where and exactly how that motor would function.
Yeah, it absolutely would. If you can imagine, only 10% of it is making itself available for off-site delivery with farmers and landowners and investors that are putting a lot of money into bringing sites forward, but it's a very small market at the moment. Then you get 9 times that market suddenly being made available through this change in policy preference. That's a very big impact on area. But then, and that's every year, of course. But then, if you as I've said just around the legacy that BNG will leave for the corporate sector, getting the corporates involved in this, not just the developers, then that is where you're into billions of pounds a year available for nature recovery, nature restoration. And that will, if you compare what we've been providing in terms of agri-environment payments, what's that, 2.4 billion? We could actually end up with 5 or 6 times that amount of finance available for farmers and landowners, and that would be transformational. And we can do it quickly. Within 10 years, we could actually have an incredibly powerful nature restoration industry, if you like, that is supported by people not just growing food, but the whole range of other ancillary and critically important activities that the farmer and landowner can get into. Growing the stock to create the woodlands or the shrubby areas, etc., at no impact on food security, which I'm sure is also a focus of our minds.
Yeah, indeed. Rob, we've been sort of talking on the podcast so far on the assumption that moving off-site's a good idea, and that it's much easier to deliver BNG off-site. Could you just talk us through why it is so much more challenging to deliver BNG on development sites?
Okay, well, we need to unpick the premise of the question, because it's perfectly feasible to meet the policy and legal requirements to deliver BNG on site, as we are seeing. It is difficult to do it in a way that meets the underlying policy objectives because of some of the reasons we've discussed about small scale and all the rest of it. But if you just think through the practicalities of and this is mainly a residential conversation, but it actually will start with a non-residential, because you think of the practicalities about a retail site or a warehouse site, a logistics site, whatever it might be, and they don't tend to be very green. They don't want to be very green. They are built environments with hard landscaping for car parking, access and egress, and that's what they want. That's the functionality. So there's not a lot of room for BNG on those sorts of sites. Residential is a lot more nuanced, because obviously you have generally, I don't quite know what the balance is between brownfield and greenfield, but if you're developing a greenfield site, you've got choices, you've got opportunities on how big you make the site, so you can fit in stuff around the edge. You've often got topography to play with and think about. You might have wet areas, you might have hillocky areas. So there are often opportunities to deliver BNG on site, and to deliver BNG through a really well thought through and coherent landscaping plan. So it's perfectly feasible to do it, but it's not very effective, as we've discussed. And as soon as you move away from a site that's in any way nuanced, and you're simply looking at, and we've all seen them as we've driven around the country, the field on the edge of village town, which is flat, open, has one hedge and a bit of fence around it, and is fairly uninteresting and improved grassland, then that's a perfect development site to optimize the delivery of the housing product that you want to meet the housing supply we all need in a way that's viable. And yes, there'll be a requirement through planning policy to consider the impact on any protected species and ecology, and to address that. And yes, there'll be a need to make the site attractive in terms of verges and the way you approach it as you move through it, and gardens and the borders of the site and its connectivity and sort of leakage into the surrounding countryside. But that's all a development driven master planning output. It's not a nature driven biodiversity output. So in the significant majority of housing sites, particularly settlement extension housing sites, you're starting with a site that is fundamentally well suited to housing development. That's why it's been selected, and you're seeking to cram in things which are entirely often in tension with the core purpose of developing the site, which is to optimize the housing supply from the piece of land that you're dealing with. And so it is possible to do it, but it is very, very often suboptimal in terms of the core policy objectives that we're trying to deliver, and fundamentally that's around adding to nature, enabling nature recovery, driving private funding into nature recovery, and providing access to people to enhance nature and enhance biodiversity, which is far better done in somewhere that you can invite people into. No one's going to invite. You're not going to get people from 3 villages away wandering through for a dog walk, or a pleasant afternoon through the village's housing estate. That's not what it's been designed for.
And we in the report we say that something of the order of around 25 hectares and above might well be able to do some BNG within the site, which has got value to biodiversity. Anything lower than that, really, it's not. And as Rob said, people aren't going to get their Sunday afternoon walk value from walking through someone's housing scheme.
We talked earlier on, David, about the connection between the delivery of nature for nature's sake, and then the delivery of nature because it's something that human beings like to be around. And so if we're talking about a change in emphasis, a shift in emphasis away from on-site delivery to off-site delivery, if I'm sort of thinking of a housing estate, it would be nice to think that there was nature within that estate. So does this mean that there's unlikely to be any nature uplift within that development site if the BNG is being delivered away from the new development?
No, not at all. I think the problem has been where the small developments try and conflate access to natural green space and biodiversity uplift. That's the big problem. It doesn't work on the whole, and particularly the smaller the site you've got, the more difficult that is. But in terms of inherent value, you can imagine if you've got 100-hectare habitat banks, 250 acres that people could have an access to in some shape or form, far more interesting and valuable than a few bits of scrubby areas within a housing scheme that gets streamed away because it becomes untidy. What people want and what developers are doing is providing residential areas for people to live with, where they've got really good landscaping and planting. But landscaping and planting and green space isn't biodiversity. But you will get an uplift in the commoner generic things that you'd expect to find in those sorts of places. You'll get an increase in invertebrates and all the rest of it. But in terms of real biodiversity value, you've got to look at larger sites, which is where you can get your more specialist species. And that's where biodiversity really starts to uplift. And that's why we've got a lot of the more speculative providers of habitat banks providing some phenomenal areas. I mean, really exciting work that at one time was probably just the domain of the environmental NGOs. But they haven't got access to land in the same way or scale that we actually need to shift the dial big time on biodiversity. You've got to do it at large scale, and BNG is one of the tools off-site that can enable that to happen.
So, Rob, working on the basis that if this emphasis on site BNG were to change, were to shift, and in the future we started to see quite an acceleration potentially, most of the BNG units being delivered off-site, I'm interested in planning terms about whether there are currently planning incentives for developers to deliver nature positive developments on site, or whether that's all down to the whim of the architect or the desire of the developer in terms of the type of development that they're building and the type of house buyer that they're trying to attract.
Planning incentives. Well, there are planning incentives through the need to deal with issues around protected species. And so, that's where you often see bat boxes, barn owl, owl boxes, and the like. And those are different from an additional to BNG, and those aren't going away. And then there is the requirements within individual local development plan policies around, particularly around landscape and around integrating new build development effectively into landscape, and that brings with it the introduction of enhanced habitat of one form or another into a development scheme. And as David's saying, that landscaping isn't necessarily the right habitat for the optimum delivery of nature on the site, but it still will have a beneficial impact. New trees will provide nesting places, new hedgerows will provide shelter, new water bodies will provide opportunities for different kinds of wildlife. So there remain within the planning system requirements to deliver build development in a way that is harmonious in terms of landscape and doesn't and responds to the needs of the species that are being displaced one way or another. Those pre-existed prior to BNG, and they continue to exist.
And presumably there are good market reasons for a lot of developers. I mean, probably not in every single development, but sort of generally speaking, to make those new developments as attractive as they possibly can.
Absolutely, there is a clear market incentive to do that in many ways and in many places, there is significant opportunity for biodiversity within many gardens, but obviously that can't be controlled or delivered through the planning system.
And of course, you've got no legal recourse if the owners change that. I mean, I've seen situations where gardens have been put into the legal agreement; they have to keep them for that biodiversity. But of course, that's not necessarily within the power of the LPA at all to actually enforce that. There's no enforcement, and why would there be? If people want to put decking in and change the garden structure, it's their ownership. So that's another silly part to the policy, which is why offsite is so much better, because it's much better controlled through legal agreements and conservation covenants, etc.
I think we've talked this through to a relative extent already, but just to sort of summarize, David, about the key benefits of off-site BNG delivery.
Much bigger, so multiple developments in a region can contribute to one or two really big sites, and big sites are much better. Bigger, better, and joined is the mantra that we ecologists often use. You can't get that with on-site. So off-site gives bigger, better, and joined. You get more niches within the big sites for your more specialist species as well. And actually, at a landscape scale, it just looks better. I can take you to 100-hectare sites, which are fantastic for wildlife within a few years. And so much better for biodiversity, better for the developer, actually, because they can, say that they've made the contributions into these sites. People can go and see them. Much better for the rural economy, because landowners, farmers can see it as a diversification of their income streams, which is really good, particularly at the moment. And much better for government, because it actually means that government policy is delivering something of value, whereas at the moment, the government policy for on-site BNG is delivering very little, probably causing too much of a headache. And rather than have exemptions or complicated ins and outs of whether or not you are or not doing it, just get payment into a market-based mechanism. Job done. Developers happy, the community are happy, the landowners are happy, and nature is happy.
I think over the course of the conversation, we've kind of covered off a lot of the recommendations, not just the findings, but also the recommendations within the report. Are there particular things that you'd like to draw out that you don't think we quite covered as yet, David?
I think we've covered most of the key points. I think I would say I think there's a great opportunity for this government to make BNG really work for as I said, for nature, natural capital, building resilience into landscapes as well, because that's, for one thing, that small pockets of biodiversity on the site of a development are not going to do anything for climate change effects going forwards. So I want to see the whole thing looked at in the round and get government to take the initiative to switch this preference from on-site to off-site. Makes it easier for everyone, much less expensive. In fact, actually, the costs become pretty insignificant in the scheme of things, and then they can take credit for it, because I think it's desperately needed. It's a great way for doing BNG, and the government could take the credit for, taking this forwards and making these fantastic places in the countryside as well.
So just working on the assumption that that happens, and we'll come to the likelihood of that perhaps in just a moment, but for the sake of argument, the government removes that delivery preference for on-site. It leaves it to the developer to do what they think is best. Do you think that there would be a rapid race then to suddenly shift everything towards farmland?
I think there would be a race. It's difficult to know how rapid it would be, but actually there is already significant growing provision for off-site. So I don't think the developers would find it difficult to buy their off-site units now. I think maybe 18 months ago, well, as the policy was brought in, that was probably the case, but there are a lot of providers out there now, all doing a really good job professionally, with investment, 30 years guaranteed. So I think that there will be quite a race, but I think that the people delivering those sites are, up for it and have got the finances backing them to make sure that they can provide what the developers need.
And I imagine, Rob, that there would be a concern, if farmers were listening to this, a sort of a worry that if lots of farmland was going into biodiversity net gain, that might have an impact on food security and on fibre production. So what would BNG delivery, a big uplift in BNG delivery towards farmland, what would that mean for food and fibre production? Can these things be stacked, or do they need to be delivered separately?
No, they can absolutely be stacked. The vast majority of land that's being put into BNG remains in production of food and fibre in one form. There tends to be a transition from cropping land to grassland, but there is absolutely you can produce protein and fibre on species-rich grassland and on much of the area that's being put into BNG. It's only when you come to sort of long-term landscape change, planting woodland, and maybe even permanent water bodies, that you might lose land entirely from production. Although even with woodland and seasonal water bodies, then an element of production can remain, ongoing once the woodland's mature enough to deal with that. So this is not a zero-sum game. This is very much a situation where you can incorporate BNG into a more mixed and regenerative farming system very readily. What you probably can't do is incorporate it into a monocultural combinable cropping or root cropping operation, unless you want to have an element of mixed farming within that.
You mentioned protein there, of course, and I was sort of thinking while you were talking about orchards, and if you've got nature-friendly orchards, then that's a really nice way of including woodland and some fantastic sort of habitat.
I think the other thing is that the timing's brilliant, because with the move towards regenerative agriculture, reducing the cost of high inputs, and actually the way monoculture's gone, where you still have got now a much less resistance to much greater resistance to pesticides, fungicides, insecticides, molluscicides, and herbicides than you had a few years ago. And the reason is that the landscapes become much less complex. So when you have these habitat banks interspersed amongst regenerative agriculture and also some monocultures, the actual productivity of those for food will probably be much greater. And let's not be fickle about this. There is nothing secure about the way we grow food at the moment, because we're so reliant on chemical inputs. We've got to move that away, not least because of the energy consumption that they create. So that's got to die off, and we've got to find these new regenerative methods. So in my mind, the most amazingly good biodiversity landscapes will be regeneratively farmed landscapes, growing food in an agroecological approach, with habitat banks where you've got these future semi-natural habitats being created in a mosaic, a big landscape and catchment scale. And I think we will then see really big uptake in biodiversity that we can be measuring, and show that we're reversing the catastrophic decline that we've overseen over the last 60 years.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm sure, farmers listening to what you've just had to say there, David, will see their own land and be able to envision that, because, as you say, regenerative agriculture just completely lends itself to this idea of stacking, where you're producing food in balance with nature. And if you're able to stack in natural capital delivery within that as well, then you're making your business and your own economics so much more resilient than it was previously. So, Rob, on the assumption that there are going to be farmers listening here who would like to benefit from that change, how do they register their land for BNG delivery?
Well, if they want to be a provider, they can do it themselves. And if they want to do that, then they do need to get registered on the national BNG register, which is looked after by Natural England. That's not the only way to engage in the BNG market. They can also land managers can also work with an established or an emerging habitat bank business as either a land provider and or a manager, and I think there is the beginnings of a really quite rich supply chain. If this off-site market develops the way we believe it can, then we're going to see, alongside that, the development of a really rich supply chain to professional habitat bankers. Think about the stock that is needed to manage these habitats effectively, the skills that are needed to run the stock that are needed to manage these habitats effectively, the plants that are going to be needed, the seed mixes, the trees, and the machinery and the application of the machinery to manage these emerging and then maintaining habitats that fundamentally don't really exist within the mainstream agriculture sector right now. So there's going to be a really rich opportunity for farmers and land managers of all kinds to pivot towards that supply chain if they wish to. They don't necessarily have to be the BNG provider to be part of the BNG market.
And just sort of following that point on a little bit, if there's a farmer with the odd hectare that they would like to stick into BNG, are they able to access this market, or do they need to be kind of part of a cluster group of farmers within a landscape? Is it possible for habitat banks to look at the odd hectare here and there, or does it need to be a sort of a slightly higher level of volume?
So, looking at it from the individual perspective, it is absolutely possible. So say you let's take your acre in the corner. We think we might plant an orchard. Can we put that orchard forward as a BNG benefit into the marketplace? Absolutely, you can. There are a number of intermediaries who are aggregating different providers who would take that on and take it to market. Now, is that absolutely the best way of delivering strategic nature recovery? Probably not, but there needs to be an opportunity for all different sorts of actors in this market, and there can be an opportunity for all different sorts of actors in this market. And I think that it's, just because you're small doesn't mean you can't play a part, but what you should be thinking about is, what part am I best suited to play? What's the best sort of habitat that I can bring forward on my part of land that best fits within the wider biodiversity network that I'm then going to be contributing to? So don't bring forward something that there isn't any of in your county. Bring forward something that there always was, and there needs to be more of, so that it all fits together.
I'm thinking back to that word that David used, mosaic. We're talking about a mosaic of BNG delivery stacked alongside a mosaic of other land use and nature-friendly food and fibre production. David, just finally, we've talked all this through as if it's almost an inevitability that it's going to happen. How likely is it that government are going to follow your recommendations?
I think it's likely now, because I wasn't so sure, but then when you see the consultation that they did on national infrastructure projects, it doesn't have any preference for on-site. It is much more balanced, and that identifies to me that the thinking has moved away from this small-scale, fragmented, pretty irrelevant on-site delivery model to something that really can make a big contribution. So I am very hopeful, and as I said before, the government can take a lot of credit for doing that. It wasn't the policy preference wasn't and isn't correct. They can shift it. Look at what they're proposing for infrastructure. I mean, for example, with infrastructure, it's very difficult often to deliver something within the site boundary anyway, for health and safety reasons. You can't actually create your biodiversity necessarily through a tunnel through which a rail line goes, because you can't manage it into the future. And so there are lots of these strategic infrastructure developers are looking for off-site solutions for lots. National Grid will be one, for example, with the new grid system that's coming in, and they will be looking for large numbers of units. And they're not going to be wanting to do it where they're going to be constrained by having to manage that for 30 years with all the costs that entails. They'll want to see an off-site delivery solution. And this is exactly the time for government to support that and do it for residential as they do for industrial and infrastructure development, as is the case with commercials, because most of the off-site sales at the moment, I think, are being done for the commercial warehousing, logistics, distribution part type of developments.
Thanks, David. Thanks both. It's been really fascinating. I said to you before we started that we were going to, try not to have too long a conversation, but it's, there've been so many nuances that we've been able to draw out, and that we've dwelt on a little, that, we've found that we've taken as long as usual in the podcast. So thank you so much for your time. That is all we have time for. I'd like to thank my guests, Rob Hindle and David Hill. Farmgate is the UK's top-ranked podcast for food security, regenerative farming and agroecology. And if you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, comment, review us, and share our links. Next week, I'll find out how nature's being given a voice in decision-making in Wales. And then the week after, I talk to Andy Cato for the latest in our Farmgate Leaders series. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been FFINLO COSTAIN. Bye for now.